Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 548. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing good. Happy to have you back on the show today, Connor. We got quite a bit of news to get through, a lot happening, particularly in Gaza, where the situation just continues to get worse and worse. And of course, all with U.S. aid and cover at the UN. So we'll be talking about all that and more on today's show. If you can, share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. Video version of the show is at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. And of course, you could listen to the show anywhere you could get audio podcasts. And we always post the show. Well, Connor does all the work on the Twitter handle, but at @con_interest is where you can follow everything going on with the show. And with that, let's get into the news today. So, Connor, we had 2 days of hearing for Julian Assange in his last-ditch effort to get the UK High Court to reverse his extradition order to the US, which of course is extremely important for the First Amendment. However, got some bad news here. Judge in Assange extradition case previously worked for MI6. So this is from Declassified UK, and the report said one of the two High Court judges who will rule on Julian Assange's bid to stop his extradition to the US represent the UK's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and the Ministry of Defense, Declassified has found. Justice Jeremy Johnson has been a specifically vetted barrister cleared by the UK authorities to access top secret information. Johnson will sit down with Dame Victoria Sharp, his senior judge, to decide the fate of WikiLeaks co-founder if extradited. Assange faces a maximum of 175 years in U.S. prison. So, of course, Connor, this is extremely important right now, and I'm going to try to do my best to talk about Assange on the show a couple times a week, find a couple stories, and keep that in the news. Again, I suspect that it will take some time before the court issues their ruling on this appeal, and it will take some time before they decide to extradite him to the UK. My guess is that Biden doesn't want this political baggage being so present in the U.S. He would rather keep it in the U.K. For as long as he can. Of course, Biden ran on ending Trump's war on journalism, and this is a massive part of it, and really the biggest part and the most damaging thing Trump truly did to journalism and the First Amendment. So I think Biden wants to downplay it, but we always had to be prepared that they could bring him to the U.S. essentially at any time now, Connor. Again, it doesn't seem like the court is probably going to rule in Assange's favor, even though they should. That's just, the way it's been going, and he likely will come to the U.S. to face charges. And once that happens, or, once we gain word on that, of course, we'll have our good friend Misty Winston on the show to tell us what we need to do to help Assange and kind of give us some new updates on that situation. All right, next up here, a couple stories on the war in Ukraine. And this one, Connor, is just one of these very dark omissions that you have from American officials about the war in Ukraine. This is from the Washington Post. U.S. officials see Ukraine as an active and bountiful military research opportunity. So the Washington Post reports, the war remains an active and bountiful research opportunity for American military planners as they look to the future, officials say. A classified year-long study on lessons learned from both sides of the bloody campaign will help inform the national defense strategy, a sweeping document that aligns the Pentagon's myriad priorities. The 20 officers who led the project examined 5 areas: ground maneuvers, air power, information warfare, sustaining and growing forces, and long-range fire capability. The Post report continues, we immersed them in this conflict to make sure they really understanding the implications of warfare, said a senior defense official who spoke on the condition of anonymity. The characteristics of war are changing, another official said, and the lessons taken from Ukraine stand to be an enduring resource. The war complicated a long-held belief in the Pentagon that expensive precision-guided munitions are essential to winning America's conflicts. One of the officials said. GPS-guided munitions provided to Ukraine have proven vulnerable to electronic jamming. Its military has adapted by pairing older unguided artillery with sensors and drones, which can be used to spot targets and refine their shots. U.S. military commanders have certainly taken notice, she said. And so this is probably going to mean we're going to be spending a lot more money, Connor, in the Pentagon budget on anti-jamming equipment and weapons, and then weapons that could bypass those as well. All right, next up here, this one from the Associated Press. Bad news here. Of course, Connor, the Pentagon says, boy, is Ukraine a good place to research war and to see how the Russians fight and the tactics we could use. And this is the situation in Ukraine. Ukrainian commanders say they barely have enough soldiers to hold back Russia. So the AP reports Ukrainian commanders say they don't have enough soldiers to launch offensives and barely enough to hold positions amid intensifying Russian assaults. Brigades of 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers are typically kept fighting with only 75% of their full strength, according to a lawmaker who is a part of the Parliament's National Security and Defense and Intelligence Committee. A Ukrainian soldier who fought recently in the city of Advika, where soldiers retreated last week to save lives, well, I think because they were absolutely forced to retreat, he said his unit was recently outnumbered by about 5-1 when dozens of Russian soldiers stormed their position, killing everyone but himself and 2 others. The AP report continues. Because there are not enough new recruits, soldiers on the front lines aren't getting enough rest between rotations. 2 years of grueling battles have left men fatigued and more susceptible to injury. When there are new recruits, they are too few, too poorly trained, and often too old, according to interviews with 24 Ukrainian soldiers, including 6 commanders. One solution to Ukraine's manpower shortage is to expand the conscription and increase punishment on those who avoid the war. In addition to dropping the conscription age, a proposed law in Ukraine says any individual who fails to respond to call-up notices could potentially have their bank accounts frozen and their ability to travel outside the country restricted. One Ukrainian who is avoiding conscription told the AP, "It's a feeling that everyone wants to throw you into the meat grinder." All right, Connor, I got a couple stories on the situation in Israel, particularly in Gaza, before I hand it over to you. This one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Israel intensifies airstrikes in Rafah as invasion looms. Israel intensified airstrikes in Rafah on Wednesday as Israeli officials are threatening to invade the city, which is packed with an estimated 1.5 million Palestinians. Reuters report that the Israeli bombardment in Rafah killed over a dozen members of the Al-Noor family, including a 1.5-year-old girl. At the site of the bombed house, Palestinians criticized the U.S. for vetoing a ceasefire resolution at the UN Security Council and for its support of the Israeli onslaught. Gaza's health ministry said that a total of 118 Palestinians were killed in Gaza from February 20th to the 21st, bringing the toll up to 29,313, with nearly 70,000 others wounded. About 2/3 of the casualties are women and children. Israeli officials also said they intensified operations in the nearby city of Khan Yunis, where Israeli forces are fighting Hamas on the ground. Fighting also continued up north in northern Gaza, where the IDF says one of its soldiers was killed on Monday. The Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz has threatened that Israel will invade Rafah by Ramadan, which begins on March 10th, if Hamas doesn't release the remaining Israeli captives, and it doesn't seem like there's any deal on the horizon for the hostage release, Connor, but it does seem like the Israeli military operations are going to happen very soon. This from Bloomberg, just published February 22nd. That's the date we're recording. Israel will push 1.5 million Palestinians from Rafah with no plans for where they will go. Bloomberg reports Israel is determined to push ahead with a goal to move 1 million or more civilians from Rafah before an attack on the Hamas-held city in Gaza, even though officials acknowledge in private they have no precise strategy for how to do it, how long it will take, or where the people will go. Western officials are growing increasingly alarmed at the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the U.S. and its allies have been pressing Israel for details on how it plans to move the civilian population north. While officials believe that Israel will conduct its military operations in Gaza no matter what, according to people familiar with the matter, there is no concern about the Ramadan deadline and the broader humanitarian strategy. And then this was also a quote from the Bloomberg article. And it's just something that's not going to get attention, Connor, but is so important and is so blatantly written here. Officials say ending the war is now Hamas's singular goal, and it's something Israel will not do. And so they're saying Hamas will do anything to end this war, and Israel will simply not agree to it. And just so clearly written in Bloomberg, I think is pretty important here. Next up, Israeli Knesset overwhelmingly bats Netanyahu's rejection of a Palestinian state. So the Israeli Knesset has overwhelmingly backed a resolution put forward by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that rejects a unilateral creation of a Palestinian state. 99 out of 120 lawmakers in the Knesset voted in favor of the resolution, according to Ynet. Israel's Labor Party boycotted the vote, and 11 Arab lawmakers voted against it. The majority of the leading opposition parties, National Unity and Yesh Atid, voted in favor. Netanyahu celebrated the strong support for the legislation. He said, "I commend the Knesset members, including those from the opposition, who voted today overwhelmingly in favor of my proposal that Israel opposes being unilaterally dictated to establish a Palestinian state. I don't recall many votes, in fact hardly any, where the Knesset voted with a majority of 99, nearly 100 members out of 120 on any proposal." And Connor, that is something that's really important here. And there's this, I think, narrative that the White House really likes, and that is there are problems in Israel, but those problems are Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and Netanyahu. And it doesn't extend all the way through the Israeli legislature or the Israeli society, and it certainly does through the legislature, and this vote is just another example of it. The solution here is not just to wait out Netanyahu and hope there are Palestinians still living in Gaza by the end of it, Connor, but that's what the White House seems to be doing at this point, and it's just so unfair to the Palestinians. All right, next up here, Connor. Israel attacked UN aid convoy after approving delivery. So this is from a CNN article, and I made reference to it on the last episode of the show. I thought this had happened earlier this week, but it actually happened on February 5th. So the CNN report says Israeli forces fired on United Nations convoy carrying vital food supplies in central Gaza on February 5th before ultimately blocking the trucks from progressing to the northern part of the territory, where Palestinians are on the verge of famine, according to documents shared by the UN and CNN's own analysis. CNN has seen correspondence between the UN and the Israeli military that showed the convoy's route was agreed upon by both parties prior to the strike, according to an internal incident report compiled by UNRWA, the main UN relief agency for Gaza, which was also seen by CNN. The truck was one of 10 in the convoy sitting stationary at an IDF holding point when it was fired upon. No one in the convoy was hurt, but much of the contents, mainly wheat, flour, and desperately needed to make bread, were destroyed. Tracing the strike offers a window into the major challenges that humanitarian efforts face getting aid into Gaza's more than 2 million people, nearly 85% of whom are internally displaced. And Connor, this is something that I discussed at quite a bit of length today with Scott Horton on his LA news show, so that will definitely be available on the Libertarian Institute sometime this weekend. But one of the things I pointed about is there's so many places where Israel is choking the aid into Gaza. It's doing it at the ports, where the finance minister Smotrich is preventing the U.S. funded flour from being able to enter into Israel and start to get distributed. It's the Israeli protesters that are delaying trucks. It's the Israeli inspections that are taking out desperately needed medicine from the shipments and preventing it from entering Gaza and generally delaying the process. It's the Israelis killing the Palestinian police force in Gaza that was protecting the aid shipments and allowing them to be maneuvered and distributed in Gaza. And then also it's the actual attacks on the aid shipments that are happening as well. All right, Connor, one more here before I hand it over to you. U.S. tells UN court Israel must be allowed to continue occupation of Palestine. I wrote this one for the Institute on February 21st. A State Department official speaking before the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, urged the body not to order Israel to end the occupation of Palestine. The court is currently hearing arguments in a case that calls on Israel to end the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. The ICJ will hear arguments from more than 50 countries over 6 days. On the third day of the trial, State Department legal advisor Richard Visk argued that the ICJ that Israel needs to continue the occupation of Gaza for security reasons. He said the court should not find that Israel is legally obligated to immediately and unconditionally withdraw from the occupied territory. Any movement towards Israel's withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza requires consideration of Israel's real security needs. We were all reminded of those on October 7th, and they persist. This did not mention the security needs of the Palestinian, who have suffered under decades of occupation and apartheid at the hands of the Israeli Defense Forces. Since October 7th, 29,000 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli military operations in Gaza. Tel Aviv has prevented aid from reaching the children of Gaza, putting 1 in 6 at risk of death due to starvation. The case moving through the ICJ is separate from the genocide charges brought by South Africa in December. Last month, the court issued a preliminary ruling that Israel was plausibly committing a genocide in Gaza, fueled by the rhetoric of the country's leadership. The ICJ ordered Israel to end its military operations in Gaza that endanger civilians. Tel Aviv and Washington have said they will ignore the court's decision. The second ICJ trial is examining Israel's military occupation of Palestine, which has been ongoing since 1967. Several international and Israeli human rights organizations have concluded that the occupation amounts to apartheid. For decades, Washington has underwritten the Israeli occupation of the West Bank by preventing the UN Security Council from condemning Tel Aviv's oppression of the Palestinians and by giving Israel over $250 billion in aid, including a lot of that in military assistance. On Tuesday, the U.S. vetoed the UN Security Council resolution that called for a ceasefire in Gaza. The U.S. claims that by giving Israel billions of dollars in weapons every year is establishing the conditions for a two-state solution. This told the ICJ that ruling Israel to end the occupation of Palestine will prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. He said it is important that the court keeps in mind the balance between the UN Security Council and the General Assembly have determined that it is necessary to provide the best chance for a durable peace. So, Connor, this is just almost comical, right? That this guy has, I don't know, the ability to lie to the ICJ so boldly, right? It's very clear that the Israelis are not going to agree to a two-state solution. Netanyahu just bragged about not allowing a Palestinian state for decades. The Israeli Knesset just voted on it. And this guy is going to go tell the ICJ, well, you don't want to make any hasty rulings or decisions here because you might undercut the two-state solution. It's truly remarkable. All right, Connor, I know you got some articles for us now.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, dovetailing with the ICJ hearings regarding the occupation, we had this story from Middle East Eye about what China's position is, one of the 52 countries that's being heard over these 6 days. So this is from Middle East Eye from today, actually. China tells ICJ Palestinians have the right to use armed force against Israel. So China has backed the right of the Palestinian people to use armed force to combat Israel's occupation of their land, calling it an inalienable right, an inalienable right, well-founded international law. The comments on Thursday were made by the Chinese ambassador to the UN, Zhang Jun, during the fourth day of public hearings held by the ICJ in The Hague. Representatives of 52 countries are addressing the court on Israel's decades-long occupation of Palestinian land. So Beijing's envoy said, quote, there are various people who freed themselves from colonial rule, including the Chinese and the American people, could use all available means, including they can use all available means, including armed struggle. And that's, of course, true under international law. And he described the Palestinian use of armed resistance as legitimate and not an act of terrorism. Quote, the struggle waged by peoples for their liberation, right to self-determination, including armed struggle against colonialism, occupation, aggression, domination, etc., against foreign forces should not be considered terrorist acts, Zhang Zhen told the court. In his speech, Zhang criticized Israeli policies, characterizing them as oppression that has severely undermined and impeded the exercises and full realization of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. The ICJ's public hearings, which will be held until the 26th, come after the UN General Assembly resolution, which requested an ICJ advisory opinion. So the number of states participating in the oral proceedings is the highest of any case since the ICJ's establishment back in 1945. And as Kyle mentioned, of course, this is separate to the South African charges of genocide. And a panel of 15 judges are expected to take about 6 months to deliberate before they issue their advisory opinion here on this particular case regarding the occupation. So besides China, Hungary, France, South Africa, and Egypt, as well as some other nations, will be speaking as well. International bodies, including the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the African Union will also take part. Israel will not be participating, but has apparently sent written observations to the court. And it's, ironic too. The American government has never leveled with the American people about the reality of how our support for Israel gets Americans killed. And so with these remarks by the State Department legal advisor, they're just not only lying to the whole world in front of this world court, but they're also lying to the American people once again, suggesting that Israel's security depends on the indefinite occupation of the Palestinians, which on its face is ridiculous. But of course, the more important issue for Americans is at what cost does that come to us? And are there any benefits for supporting Israel? And of course, we see that no, it's bleeding us by the billions and much more than that over the course of these last decades, and $250 billion given Israel. And then also attacks like 9/11, which are largely motivated by U.S. support for Israel. But they're continuing to expand the war. This next story is from Dave DeCamp from the 21st. Israeli airstrike on residential building in Syria kills 2. So an Israeli airstrike hit a residential building in Damascus on Wednesday this week, killing 2 civilians and wounding 1, according to Syria's Sanaa news agency. So they report that, quote, at nearly 9:40 a.m. on Wednesday, the Israeli enemy carried out an aerial aggression from the direction of the occupied Syrian Golan, targeting a residential building in Kafr Sosa neighborhood in Damascus, a Syrian military source told Sanaa. Now, according to an AP reporter who was on the scene, the strike damaged the 4th floor of a 10-story apartment building. Dave's piece here actually has a picture of the damage, shattering window glass on nearby buildings and damaging dozens of cars parked in the area. The AP report said that an empty park bus for a nearby school was also damaged, and people were seen rushing to the school to take their children. Israeli officials have not commented on the attack. And that's, business as usual. As Dave notes here, they rarely acknowledge individual airstrikes in Syria. However, Israel has been bombing Syria with impunity for years, as we've been covering nearly every week on the show, and has significantly escalated its bombing campaign in the country since October 7th, including assassinating several IRGC officials and carrying out more assassinations and attacking civilian infrastructure like the Aleppo and Damascus international airports. And so Israeli airstrikes over the last few months risk a major regional war. Even though tensions since the U.S. Bombing of Iraq and Syria, which killed about 40 people, and the further assassinations of the commander for Kataib Hezbollah in Baghdad. I mean, these were major escalations that could have risked a broad war that the Biden administration took for largely political reasons. But thankfully, the Iranians have once again, just like they did after the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, taken a more restrained approach, preventing an all-out war, which would cost Americans dearly. So no thanks to our own so-called leadership class. But, I mean, this kind of reckless behavior by the Israelis is almost certainly intended to provoke wider conflict that would draw the United States in, as we've had been warned by U.S. officials, anonymous U.S. officials, in notable pieces the last couple of months from the Huffington Post and the Washington Post, about how the war cabinet in Israel is virtually hell-bent, or almost entirely hell-bent, on launching this war against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And of course, that would bring in a lot of not only the Hezbollah forces in Syria as well, but their allies with the IRGC, and potentially even if Israel wants to escalate there, we have our American troops have still not been pulled out of the country. So you got a lot of tripwire forces there as well. It's a huge powder keg, and these kind of strikes are only intended to make problems worse. So according to Reuters, Israel killed Iranian advisors in that neighborhood last year, the Kafr Sousa neighborhood, but Iran's semi-official student news network said that no Iranian citizens were killed in this most recent strike on Wednesday. So we'll keep our eye on that, see if there's any update. This next story is about So actually, I have this next story about what's been going on in Lebanon. So this is from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Israeli airstrikes kill a woman and a child in southern Lebanon. And this is from the 21st as well. So Israel continued its escalation of operations against southern Lebanon on Wednesday as well. So the same day both these strikes. So firing airstrikes against a series of towns and villages in the area. An engineering brigade was also dispatched into Lebanon to clear out 30 kilometers of all border routes between the area and northern Israel. The Israeli military claimed that the targets hit included 3 operational headquarters of Hezbollah, or what they're calling operational headquarters, the Israelis, of Hezbollah, although there was no word of any Hezbollah casualties. However, a strike on a house in Majdal Zun killed a woman and wounded her child. The woman was identified in reports as Kajda Salman. A second unidentified girl was also reported killed in the strike. So Hezbollah responded to the latest day of strikes with rocket fire of their own, hitting the kibbutz of Metula. A house was hit in the kibbutz, but no casualties have been reported on the Israeli side. Hezbollah reported that it was attacking military installations in the area in response to Israeli attacks on civilian homes. The latest round of attacks comes a day after Defense Minister Yoav Gallant bragged that Israel could hit any corner of Lebanon they wish. So far, however, the majority of strikes have just hit southern border areas. So with the occasional hit as far north as the coastal city of Sidon. They recently launched strikes about 40 miles into Lebanon. The town of Gaza near Sidon was hit earlier this week, with airstrikes causing major fires and damages against a pair of factories in the town. The Israeli military maintains that the factories were weapons depots for Hezbollah, although owners were quoted in Lebanese media saying that that was not the case and that the premises contained no weapons. Israel presents the attacks on southern Lebanon as targeting Hezbollah in general. Tel Aviv has demanded that Hezbollah be removed from the border region, and the two sides have been trading strikes across the border since early October with no end in sight. Hezbollah says they intend to continue to support the Palestinians despite Israel's escalation of attacks on Lebanon. Now, last week, Israeli airstrikes against southern Lebanon killed at least 10 civilians. And Hezbollah retaliated against those strikes by firing anti-tank rockets, which are very good at bypassing Israel's defenses, into the north of Israel proper, while Israel responded by attacking sites that they claim were the source of the rockets. So this leads to then further retaliation from Hezbollah, and then with retaliation from Israel, which is how the campaign of strikes has dragged on these past months. Polls show that while Lebanon in general does not want to see an Israeli offensive against the country, a 2/3 majority supports Hezbollah, believing the group is concerned with the Lebanese national interest. And it's in the American mainstream media. Hezbollah is painted as almost interchangeable with Al Qaeda, but it's just, I mean, they're the fourth largest. They're a political party and a military force in Lebanon. It rose up in the early '80s in opposition to repeated Israeli invasions and a nearly 20-year occupation of southern Lebanon, as well as further Western intervention, including from the Americans. And so this is viewed as a legitimate resistance movement, and their enemies are in fact not just the Israelis, but of course Al Qaeda and ISIS, who they help wipe out in Syria. And so this is a very dangerous there and war that Israel is picking, and that the Americans will no doubt be dragged into. And it is definitely not a fight that we can handle right now. And so, I mean, it's just ridiculous to see that there is no political will on the part of the Biden administration to restrain this at all. In fact, that's what those American officials were lamenting in these articles I was referencing earlier, where they say that we're in an absolutely horrible situation because Biden has given Israel this unconditional blank check, and the Israelis are going to take the war next to southern Lebanon, and they're going to take on Hezbollah. And there's been assessments that have been leaked to for the Washington Post, for instance, by the DIA, that suggest that Israel it's impossible for them to maintain that two-front war themselves. They're going to be spread way too thin, and they may get their claw cleaned by Hezbollah. And of course, the U.S. will come in and takes a lot of losses ourselves in that fight in order to defend Israel while it commits genocide and ethnic cleansing. So now the next Israeli front of the war, we're going to go back to the West Bank. This story is from The Cradle, February 20th. Settlers burn through West Bank village under army protection. So Israeli settlers are rampaging through the West Bank village of Burqa, northwest of Nablus, on the evening of February 19th, attacking homes, destroying vehicles under the protection and coordination of the IDF. And settlers threw Molotov cocktails at several Palestinian homes as Israeli troops shut down all main roads to the village. Palestinian news agency Wafa reported that Israeli troops, quote, did nothing to stop the colonists' attack, adding that the Israeli forces used large amounts of tear gas and prevented ambulances from reaching the wounded. This is just outright terrorism by any definition. Earlier on Monday, Israeli settlers, with the help of the troops, fenced off a tract of Palestinian-owned land south of Jerusalem with barbed wire to occupy it. Settler violence against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank has surged to all-time highs under Netanyahu's government. It has escalated even further since Operation Al-Aqsa Flood and the Gaza war. So since the 7th of October last year, and Palestinians have been subject to increasing levels of forced displacement since the war began. Over 1,000 people, including hundreds of children, have been forced by settlers and the Israeli army soldiers to abandon their homes, and that's according to the UN. Additionally, more settlers are being armed. Thousands of weapons have been handed out to settlers in the occupied West Bank under an initiative sponsored by the Israeli National Security Ministry and Itamar Ben-Gvir, who Kyle mentioned earlier, the radical settler Minister of National Security. And according to the Israeli watchdog NGO Peace Now, the settlers are establishing a record-breaking 26 outposts in the occupied West Bank in 2023. The report correlates the rise in unlawful settlement construction with the Jewish supremacist policies of the Israeli government. Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank are, of course, illegal under international law. Nonetheless, the Don't Buy Into Occupation Civil Society organization highlighted in December that European financial institutions have been providing billions of dollars to support construction of settlements, these Jewish-only colonies, in the occupied West Bank over the past few years. And of course, this is, 2023, especially when the deaths in the West Bank skyrocketed by the hundreds after the war against Gaza began. The UN had to come out and put out a whole report about that we covered on the show about how this has been the deadliest year, or at least 2023. This year is likely going to be worse. Has been the deadliest year for children in the West Bank. And at this point, the death toll in the West Bank since October 7th is at almost 400. It's 395 people killed, including more than 105 children, and we have 4,450 injured. So just, with no end in sight, as we've been covering, the ethnic cleansing is continuing apace in the West Bank. And when they complain that, especially major pro-Zionists in the United States, well, we need this money. Israel needs this money and this military aid because they're facing a multi-front war. Well, they're very obviously the aggressor here. And as people can see, I mean, one of the things that we had covered early on about this situation in the West Bank was that as more and more of these settlers who are in the IDF or in the reserves are going to Gaza or up to the northern front near southern Lebanon, you have a lot of these settlers who are now, they were radical settlers committing, terrorist acts, attacking, the elderly people or children, or burning olive trees, or, doing this kind of these kind of attacks, throwing Molotov cocktails or at homes or desecrating holy sites. But now, or just shooting olive farmers, this sort of thing, they're now wearing IDF uniforms and going out and committing pogroms against Palestinians in the middle of the night and burning their homes and forcibly depopulating villages in rural areas, especially outside Hebron. There's a great report from 972 Mag about that. And, many of these guys have criminal records, as we've read and reported on here from that piece in Haaretz, that they have loosened any kind of restrictions they have, and they're looking into making exceptions and bringing in people who have already been proven to be violent criminals and bringing them in, these ultra-Orthodox settlers. So just a horrible situation, pretty unfathomable to imagine being a child in the West Bank right now, let alone anybody else. So, okay. Now this next story we have... Well, again, Representative Andy Ogle says, kill them all, asked about dead Palestinian kids. This is from Dave DeCamp on February 21st. So if you thought that the American Congress couldn't get any worse or more despicable or irredeemable, you were wrong. So Representative Andy Ogle, the Republican out of Tennessee, was confronted by peace activists. I saw Medea Benjamin covering this. I'm not sure if these people were affiliated with Code Pink. So they confronted this guy in Washington on Tuesday about the Israeli slaughter in Gaza, and it sparked an outcry because he said, I think we should be killing them all if that makes you feel any better, when asked about Palestinian children being killed with U.S. support. So the activist says, I've seen footage of shredded children's bodies. That's my taxpayer dollars that are going to bomb those kids. And he says, I think we should kill them all if that makes you feel better. And this actually, if you watch the clip, is prefaced because she's saying that there's so many kids being starved to death and killed. And then he says to her, Hamas raped and murdered babies, or decapitated babies. And of course, they tell him that that's not true. And what the girl says then is, I have seen footage, because he says, have you seen the footage or something like that? So many of these people just assume, I think, honestly, they're just ignorant. They assume because the propaganda for so long was, did you see the videos? I mean, hell, Biden said that. I saw the video, or Kirby said the same thing. And images of 40 decapitated babies, and then the White House had to walk it back. But there's been a lot of this regurgitation from pro-Zionists in the media, where they just pretend that they've seen videos that don't exist. When in the meantime, everybody's social media feeds are absolutely flooded with dead children in Gaza every single day, dead women, people, losing all their limbs, and entire city blocks being destroyed, and everything else. And so, he just said that he's seen it, and then she says, I've seen the footage of shredded children's bodies, and that's my taxpayer dollars that are paying for that. So he says, I think we should kill them all. One of the other things they point out to him is the incident where the Israeli snipers in the IDF were attacking elderly women at a church, shooting elderly women at a church. And that did not seem to faze the great Republican from Tennessee, at all. Didn't even respond to her. And so the comments sparked an outcry and backlash, including from within Tennessee. In response, his office insisted that he was specifically talking about Hamas, but the congressman said kill them all, specifically after the activist referenced the children who were being murdered. Ogles also justified the brutal Israeli campaign in Gaza. He said that Hamas and the Palestinians have been attacking Israel for 20 years. It's time to pay the piper. And this actually reminds me of a lot of this rhetoric. Actually, unfortunately, reminds me of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who just makes things up like all the children in Gaza are raised to be serial killers, and he'll pretend that the rockets from Gaza are some sort of offensive threat, when in the meantime you're talking about people who have been besieged in a concentration camp, an open-air prison under a full air, land, and sea blockade for nearly 20 years. And what this was a prison break on October 7th. And yes, some atrocities were committed, but it's been so embellished just so that these people can, with a straight face, say the things that we couldn't really even imagine that you would say to peace activists gleefully, I want to kill all these kids. And Brian Mast, of course, had a similar made similar comments to the Code Pink ladies recently when he said there are no innocent Palestinian civilians across the world. And he was specifically asked about babies who were dying and being killed in Gaza. And when he was asked about, the quarter of the population, about 500,000 people in Gaza who are facing or living in actual famine conditions, not just facing the possibility of famine, he responded with a smile on his face, sadistic smile. The 500,000 people starving to death are people that should go out there and put a government in place that doesn't go out there and attack Israel on a daily basis. And of course, the reason they can't do that is because the United States and Israel launched a coup in Gaza, backing Fatah against Hamas, which just backfired, and Hamas seized total control over Gaza. And then the Israelis, ultimately having some genocidal intentions, decided to put the entire population that's half children there, of over 2 million people, under siege and continually bomb it and mow the grass, as they say, destroying all kinds of infrastructure, homes, factories, schools, clinics, etc. And then it's only gotten worse, of course, since October 7th. But thousands of people had already been killed, and it's just absolutely despicable to see this. They cannot put a government in place because, as Kyle just covered, the Israelis, who these men support completely unconditionally. In fact, one of the girls called Ogles a AIPAC zombie, which is apt. We know that the Israeli policy is to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and so they're all just liars. All right. So this next story is about escalations between China and the island of Taiwan. This is by Dave DeCamp again on the 21st. So China steps up its patrols near Taiwanese-controlled Kinmen Island. So the Chinese Coast Guard is stepping up patrols near the Taiwanese-controlled Kinmen Islands following an incident involving Taiwan's Coast Guard that ended with 2 Chinese fishermen drowning. So the Kinmen Islands are controlled by Taiwan, but are just located off the coast of mainland China, only about 3 miles away from the Chinese city of Xiamen. So last week, Taiwan's Coast Guard said a Chinese fishing boat entered prohibited waters off Kinmen, known as Quemoy, in the mainland. The Taiwanese Coast Guard claimed the fishermen refused a request for an inspection and their boat capsized as they tried to flee the area. A total of 4 people were on the boat and 2 were pronounced dead. After the incident, the Chinese Coast Guard said that they would that they would start regular patrols in the area to, quote, maintain operational order in sea areas and safeguard fishermen's lives and property. So China followed through on the statement as the Chinese Coast Guard officials briefly boarded a Taiwanese cruise ship for an inspection on Monday. The next day, Taiwan said that it drove away Chinese Coast Guard vessels that entered waters near Kinmen. And the tensions on the island of Kinmen come just after Taiwanese media revealed that the U.S. has deployed an unspecified number of military advisors, Green Berets, to the islands. A significant provocation considering how close the territory is to mainland China. This would be like if China sent their special forces to Martha's Vineyard or something. According to Taiwan's United Daily News, U.S. Army Green Berets were sent to the island to train Taiwanese forces. And of course, we have at least something like 200 troops on the island of Taiwan itself doing the same thing openly. And when antiwar.com asked about the deployment, a Pentagon spokesman declined to comment on specific operations in Taiwan, but said, "I would highlight that our support for and defense relationship with Taiwan remains aligned against the current threat posed by the People's Republic of China." And this is extremely risky given that the strategic ambiguity policy and the one China policy, which has kept the peace, the cross-strait peace, for more than, at this point, almost 50 years. And, now the Biden administration has all but they did kill the strategic ambiguity policy, at least according to major officials like the president and Avril Haines, the director of the the director of national intelligence, as well as the head of Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral John Aquilino, and Kurt Campbell has made similar comments, maybe not as explicit, but he's now the number 2 man at the State Department and was previously the top Asia official on the National Security Council for Biden. And so, of course, we've been, escalating by sending more troops to the island. Biden's been sending more and more aircraft carrier strike groups to the region for longer deployments than Trump ever did, carrying out military drills, just off China's doorstep, and flying all these, spy planes, and just so many different provocations, and sending congressional delegations and top officials or high-level U.S. officials to the island, treating it like a sovereign state. All these things serve no benefit other than to raise tensions with China and increase the stock price of Raytheon and Lockheed. And in the meantime, there's a much more hawkish president who just won the election in Taiwan, who is the vice president under Tsai Ing-wen, who is so hawkish she was the first Taiwanese president to publicly reveal, as she did in a CNN interview, I believe 2 years ago, to boast about the U.S. troop presence on the island. So this is not a good situation. It's really hard to fathom, right? Having Chinese troops stationed training forces on where, pick Cuba or Martha's Vineyard. It's just absolutely ridiculous. We would be threatening to burn the whole world down like we did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Maybe not that bad, but certainly to go to war with China. And so it's just absolutely absurd. But this is what the Biden administration has been doing this entire time. They've been far worse on China than even the Trump administration. And so, okay, now this next story, Australia to double its naval fleet in buildup aimed at China. On Monday, this is from Dave DeCamp again on the 21st at antiwar.com. On Monday, Canberra announced a plan to increase its military spending by $7 billion and more than double its fleet of warships over the next 10 years as part of this buildup aimed at China, the pivot to Asia, which is the U.S.'s name for it, the largest military buildup since the Second World War, which was designed effectively by Kurt Campbell, who I just mentioned. Now, this is Australia's largest largest trading partner is China, and yet they're jumping on this bandwagon of the Americans shifting 2/3 of all U.S. air and naval forces to the region and encircling China with hundreds of bases for this future war. And it's interesting how that works. So according to the AFP, the plan will see Australia increase its number of surface vessels to 26, up from 11 today. Australian Defense Minister Richard Marles said it would be Australia's largest fleet since World War II. He said, quote, "What is critically important to understand is that as we look forward with an uncertain world in terms of great power contest, we'll have a dramatically different capability in the mid-2030s to what we have now," Marles said. Now, Australia is also working with the U.S. and the U.K. on the AUKUS military pact, which will arm Australia with nuclear-powered submarines with the eventual goal of Canberra being able to produce its own. Australia is expected to spend up to $245 billion on AUKUS by 2055. Of course, AUKUS undermines the entire non-proliferation regime in that part of the world, and can drastically raise tensions with China, because, of course, the reason Australia is being armed with these subs is to carry out patrols along China's coast. And they've already signed on. We've had multiple Australian officials talking about how they're going to be on the side of the U.S. in the war with China over the island of Taiwan and the status of Taiwan. Now, on top of this military buildup, Australia is allowing the U.S. to beef up its presence in Australia. Another aspect includes more deployments of U.S. troops and aircraft, including nuclear-capable B-52 bombers and naval assets to Australia. One of the plans is to turn Australia, the project they're working on is to turn it into a full-service submarine a full-service hub for submarines for the U.S. and all of its partners in any operations aimed at China for from here on out. And a report from Reuters recently revealed that last year, during the U.S. and Australia's Talisman Sabre exercises, which, like many of the exercises under the Biden administration that they carry out with their so-called allies and partners, are always the largest ever. Well, this one was the largest ever iteration of the Talisman Sabre exercises. And the report is that the U.S. left behind a new weapons stockpile in Australia, and they're looking to establish similar stockpiles in the Philippines, Japan, and possibly Taiwan. There was that infamous article in the New York Times not too long ago where they talk about turning Taiwan into a giant arms depot. I just think it's notable to point out that in 2023, the Army Secretary Christine Wormuth declared, "We need to be prepared to fight a direct hot war against China over Taiwan and win it." She said, "I'm personally not of the view that that's an amphibious invasion of Taiwan is imminent." She told an audience at the American Enterprise Institute, but she said, "We obviously have to be prepared to fight and win that war." And so just getting into this idea of the weapon stockpiles, her plan, she says, would consist of sending more American troops and advanced weapons to the region, including hypersonic missiles. And she discusses setting up what she referred to as theater distribution centers in the region, where weapons and other supplies are going to be pre-positioned for the coming war with China, suggesting that Japan and Australia would make good candidates. She said, "Our goal is to have Army forces in the Indo-Pacific 7 to 8 months out of the year. And when the war starts, the Army's job is going to be setting up staging bases for the Navy and the Marines and the Air Force, providing intra-theater sustainment." And this is what the head of the American Marine Forces in Japan, Lieutenant General James Bierman, refers to as setting the theater for war. And he's told the Financial Times that essentially what they're doing is very much analogous to the preparations for war against Russia, the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. They're sort of doing the same thing in this part of the world, targeting China. And as you can see, all the money that's being spent, just like we see with NATO partners, that the complaint is never that this is even from the Trump perspective, it's always that people aren't spending enough money on the military-industrial complex. It's not that we shouldn't even be in NATO. And when that should be the case, and I think a lot of Americans sympathize with that. But of course, so much of this is just a racket to sell weapons. But unfortunately, it can have very real consequences, like we see in Ukraine.
All right, Connor. Well, speaking of rackets to sell weapons, Pentagon developing naval drone swarms for a war with China. So the U.S. Navy will test surface and underwater drones next month in preparation for a future war with China. In the near term, American defense officials have warned that war with China over Taiwan could break out. The U.S. is developing drone swarms in other domains for war in the Pacific. And I wrote this article for the Institute on February 19th. So Admiral Sam Papiro, the head of U.S. Pacific Fleet, explained, "Beginning in March, we will execute the Integrated Battle Platform 24.1. He said it involves test and experiment with naval drone swarms. The weapons being developed include large diameter unmanned submarines and small undercrewed surface vessels that are functionally meant to be an interceptor." So I guess that would mean for potentially like torpedoes or some anti-ship missiles. The drones will be integrated with air and surface drones with AI for potential war with China. And there's a fantastic article by Michael Clare from the Tom Dispatch this week. That's absolutely the great website newsletter distributed by Tom Engelhart. And that details and goes into a lot of, not only what this means right now, particularly with the war going on, say in Gaza or in Ukraine, with AI, drones on the battlefield and things like that, but also in the future, especially when we talk about integrating AI in and having maybe some even autonomy over the weapons and things like that. This could be pretty significant. So I really recommend checking that out, and it will run next week at antiwar.com. So the admiral told the conference drones may also be key to Indo-Pacific Command's Joint Fires Network, a nascent battle management system designed to find and deliver target data to produce forces much faster. The system will use the AI and likely drones. He went on to say that the Pentagon envisioned putting tens or hundreds of thousands of sea, sub, and air drones in operation. The Department of Defense is also developing drone swarms for use in air attacks. Admiral John Aquillo, the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, discussed developing as many as 1,000 drones to be used within 24 hours. Here's a metric for me: 1,000 targets for 24 hours, he said. Deputy Secretary of State Kathleen Hitz explained the number can be scaled from the thousands to higher numbers in the future. We'll also aim to replicate and inoculate how we achieve our goals so that we can scale whatever relevant in the future again and again and again. Easier said than done, you bet, but we're going to do it, she said. To deter China from attacking Taiwan, the U.S. asserted that the U.S. needs to maintain air and maritime superiority. However, Washington's massive military buildup in the Asia-Pacific has nudged Beijing away from believing peaceful reunification with Taiwan is possible. All right, Connor, that is the show for the week. Everybody, thank you all so much for tuning in. If you didn't get a chance, I was on with Judge Andrew Napolitano this past Monday, so that's available on YouTube, and I will be sure to put that out sometime in the coming days on my Twitter feed and on the blog at the Libertarian Institute. I was additionally on with Alan Mosley, his show It's Too Late. Myself and Connor will be on with our friend Kyle. What's the name of Kyle's show?
In Liberty and Health.
In Liberty and Health tonight. I think he does a live stream. Well, I guess the live stream will already be done by the time this show is published, but you could check that out on his channel. I was also on with Scott Horton for his LA radio show. Again, that's already out, but Scott will put that up at the Institute sometime over the weekend. Connor, were you on anything else this weekend? Or this weekend?
No, not yet, but I might be doing some more shows next week.
All right, fantastic.
And I should just mention, the great Patrick McFarland is going to be on that live stream tonight with Kyle Matovic. It's I
don't know who that guy is.
I'm not too familiar with him, but I've heard good things.
Yeah. All right, well, Connor, thank you so much for being back on the show this week, and we will do more shows next week. Thanks, everyone.
Sounds good. All right, see you. Thanks, everybody.